Press the subscribe button and hit the bell icon for more updates.
Hello everyone. As you all might be aware of the Galwan Valley clash which led to the demise of 20 Indian soldiers, as responsible citizens, it's time we approach the harsh reality. Today we will be talking about why is it important to boycott China, not only for India but for every democratic country in the world. Come, let us see how it is possible to boycott China realistically and practically by us and India. Discussions are being held in Australia on how Australia as a country can reduce its dependency on China. Due to these reasons, Donald Trump in the USA had announced a trade war against China in 2018. And not only Trump, but many politicians of the opposition, the Democratic Party, also supported the trade war. So what exactly is entitled in trade war? Trade war basically means that Trump said that all the Chinese goods that come into USA should be subjected to increased tax and tariffs, which would make these goods costlier. And if these goods become costlier, then the people in USA would not want to buy them. It is a very simple method to boycott Chinese products straight away by increasing tariffs on the Chinese imports. But doing this would obviously cause USA to incur losses as well. The US companies made products in China due to cheap labor. And now when they will import their own products into the US, then it would be costlier for them to do so. Now either these companies would have to bear losses themselves or they'd rise the cost of their products. If they rise the prices of their products, then it would be a loss to the consumers. Things would become costlier for them. On the other hand, China isn't going to sit quietly either. China would also hike its import taxes for all the goods that come to China from US. So basically, this is what is called a trade war. Both the countries raise their import tariffs to make the to and from movement of goods more difficult, and this would result in economic losses for both the countries, and so it did happen. As per the calculations of the Bank of Finland, until November 2019, there was a 1% difference in the China's GDP growth rate due to this trade war, and a difference of 0.9% on the GDP rate of US. In US, the biggest losses were borne by the farmers who exported their agricultural products like soya beans to China. But Donald Trump was aware that this trade war would negatively affect the economies of both the countries. But this was not the purpose of the trade war. The purpose was to build pressure upon China and to force the latter to mend its ways to decrease the dependency of USA upon China. And both these aims were successful to some extent in some ways. Under pressure from the trade war, China finally promised to stop currency manipulation and that it would provide stronger legal protection to intellectual property, copyrights, trademarks and patents, and would help in putting an end to ongoing IP theft. China also promised that the foreign companies that come to China who are forced to transfer their technology will no longer be forced by China to do so. Only after China made these promises, a Phase 1 trade deal was signed between USA and China to mutually lower their tariffs. Another positive effect of this was that it forced several US companies to relocate their production facilities from China to some other countries if they wish to sell cheaper products. So a lot of US companies stopped dealing with China and shifted to their countries. And overall, the US dependency on China began to shrink. This can be seen in this graph. In January to April 2019 as compared to January-April 2018, what were the percentage changes in the imports of the US? There was a change of minus 10% in the imports coming to US from China. The biggest gainers in this were Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand and the Netherlands. The US companies that manufactured their products in China now shifted to these countries, Vietnam, Taiwan and Netherlands. Another graph shows that Vietnam reaped the biggest benefit out of this trade war because a number of things that were manufactured in China are also supplied by Vietnam. The aim behind the discussion on this entire trade war was to show you how easy it is to boycott Chinese products if the government imposes import tax on goods coming from China, but doing this would result in a big blow to the Indian economy. The losses would be far more than the US incurred in the US trade war. In my opinion, India is not prepared to do this. Why is India not prepared and what it can do to be prepared? Come, let us talk about this. The trade between India and China is extremely imbalanced. Talking about 2018 to 19, goods worth $70 billion were imported in India from China. And the goods exported to China from India was worth $16.7 billion. This lopsided imbalance is called a trade deficit. There is a deficit of nearly $53 billion. And this trade deficit has been increasing over the past few years. That means this is a huge advantage for China. That China has made India dependent on itself. The thing which India imports the most from China and for which India is most dependent on China is electronic stuff. For example, TVs, smartphone. Speaking of smartphones, 76% of our market is rippled with Chinese companies. Next in line are pharmaceutical products. 65 to 70% of our medicines come from China. These are the most important areas in my opinion which need thinking about how to replace Chinese goods. When we talk of boycotting, this does not mean that we will completely stop using all products from China. We will have to look for another alternatives. We will have to look for alternatives to replace them. Let us first talk about what can be done on an individual level as a consumer to replace the goods made by Chinese companies by the other companies. Doing this is very easy in some fields. For example, if we talk about Chinese software, you can instantly delete the Chinese apps from your phones. If you find an app useful, you will find a non-Chinese alternative of it pretty easily. There are numerous apps on the App Store and the Google Play Store which are of better quality, but I believe that there should be some government support to motivate the people for this. It shouldn't be that we are boycotting Chinese apps on one hand, and on the other hand, the government is making an official Indian government account in TikTok. So it is extremely essential to mount pressure on the government to at least stop doing this. Leaving aside software and talking about hardware, then this too can be achieved within 1 year. As Sonam Wangchuk had pointed out, it is not that difficult to do. We are not saying that you should throw away the Chinese smartphones that you currently possess. Don't buy a smartphone from these Chinese company. The next time you go to buy one, for example, do not buy from Oppo, Vivo, etc. There are several other available options. You can buy one from Samsung, which is a South Korean company. HTC is from Taiwan. Nokia is from Finland. Asus is another company from Taiwan. Apple is a company from US. Micromax and Lava are Indian companies. You can buy your next smartphone from any of these companies. Buy new TVs or electronics for home use from these companies. Many out of you would also point out that several of these products use parts that are made in China. What should be done in such a scenario? These things can be basically divided into 4 levels in my opinion. The first level is products made by Chinese companies. The second level is made in China products that are manufactured by some other company. For example, the iPhone. It is made by Apple, which is a US company, but it is made in China. The third level includes products that use Chinese parts. And at the fourth level are companies that have a Chinese investment in them. In my opinion, we need to stay alert at only the first level out of all these 4 levels. We need to boycott products manufactured by Chinese companies. Made in China products are not that big of a deal in my opinion, because today Apple manufactures its iPhone in China because the manufacturing costs are lowest there. But say Trump kept the import taxes high on iPhones that are made in China, or that Apple noticed that Chinese labor is increasingly becoming expensive and that they would get cheaper labor in some other country, then Apple can shift its production companies with comparative ease. and the iPhones that were made in China until yesterday will now become made in Vietnam or made in India. So this isn't that big of a problem as long as the companies, be it foreign, Indian or non-Chinese, manufacture products in China. Then I don't think that you should boycott them. You can continue using such products. There are so many Indian startups which have some percentage of their ownership in the hands of China. Chinese companies have invested their money in them. Our popular companies, Zomato, Swiggy, Ola, Paytm, Byju's, some percentage of all these companies are owned by Chinese companies. Their case is extremely interesting. On one hand, you could argue that these companies were started in India. They provide both jobs, benefit to Indians, and hence we should not boycott them. On the other hand, you could also argue that Chinese companies own some portion of these companies. So some percentage of all the profit that these companies make would go to the Chinese companies and help them make profits. And as you are aware, Chinese companies dance to the tunes of Chinese Communist Party. They would give up their entire data if the latter demanded so. I feel that both the arguments here hold weightage. We should evaluate what percentage of a company is owned by a Chinese company. If that figure is small, around 10 to 20%, then it wouldn't make that big of a difference. But if that figure touches 40 to 60%, as in the case of Paytm, then we should not use these companies, because using them would be a tantamount to transferring majority of amount to China, and Chinese companies are minting profit of them. And if the ownership is more than 50%, then the decision making also gets transferred into Chinese hands. But what about made in India products manufactured by Chinese companies? I'd say that we should avoid them in this case as well, because Chinese companies are our main target here. And finally, there are some people that say that we should boycott Chinese food as well. And that is utter rubbish. You shouldn't do this at all. Think about it. Who is making these Chinese food? The Chinese restaurants in India where Indian cooks are employed, the restaurant has been set up by some Indian who is serving other Indians. So how does it matter to the Chinese? The food is not being imported from China. In fact, you'd be surprised to know several Chinese dishes that are served in India today in the name of Chinese food have actually originated in India. You would not get such food if you ever go to China. The food that you get in India in the name of Chinese food. For example, a lot of people think that momos originate from China, but they actually are from Northeast India. So there's no benefit in boycotting things like this. But doing this, we would be going against the people of our own country and harming our own country. Doing all this would only increase racism against the Northeastern people. And a similar malarkey is being out forward here. Who is going to incur losses by doing this? Talking on the level of businesses and companies, what can they do to boycott Chinese products? We need to understand one thing first. Companies and business do what their customers demand. If the customers demand the cheapest product available, then no company is that stupid that it would bear losses and sell costlier products that no one buys. If they see that people buy made in China products because they are cheaper, then that is what they'll sell. There's no sense in blaming the companies and business in this. This is why I am saying that it makes no sense to vandalize the shops of the shop owners. We will have to motivate them in positive ways. For example, these companies can use "not made in China" as a marketing tactic. The shop owners can put up large signs in front of their shops declaring that they do not sell Chinese products. I feel that more people would want to come to such a shop. The businesses of the shops would definitely increase if the owners use this as a marketing tactic. And this is a positive way of doing this. There is no force or vandalism involved in this process. But if something more has to be done, then it has to happen on the government level. So let us now talk about what can be done on a government level to boycott China. The first thing is free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are signed to boost trade between two countries. Both countries cut down their import taxes and remove other barriers to facilitate trade between both the countries. If India wishes to reduce the imports from China and wishes to lower its dependency on China, then it will have to ink free trade agreements with rest of the countries. India's free trade agreement with Australia has been stuck in negotiation for the past 8 years. The government has been unable to negotiate with Australia to take this forward. India's free trade agreement with the European Union has been stuck in negotiations for the past 10 years. As long as India does not increase its trade with Australia and the European Union, the dependency on China cannot be lessened. Taking advantage of India's laziness, other countries are getting ahead of India. Vietnam has already inked the free trade agreement with the European Union, and India will have to bear the brunt of this. Export of footwear, marine products, garments, furniture that India sends to the European Union will now diminish, because the European Union has inked a free trade agreement with Vietnam. So the products from Vietnam would now be cheaper for the people living in European Union. India lagged behind here. Furthermore, if you consider the trade war between US and China, when US companies were looking for alternatives to import from instead on China, then India should have been their next option. But most of the US companies did not choose India and opted for Vietnam, Thailand and South Korea instead. This tells us that the economic conditions of India are not good today. This shows the failure of the Indian government. The infrastructure of India is not great. There's rampant corruption and there are several other reasons, owing to which India could not compete with Vietnam. Those companies made a beeline for Vietnam instead of coming to India. The Indian government would have to make its industries stronger and would have to improve its economic condition and its social image in order to attract such companies to India. Also, the government would have to admit what huge flops programs like Make in India and Startup India have been. Had they not been such huge flops, then the Chinese investments that you see in these startups would not have been made. Indian startups would have got support as well as investment from the Indian government, and they would have been able to sustain themselves. In the last point, I'd like to mention that India needs to improve in its foreign relations with its neighboring countries, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. India would have to increase trade with all of these countries. Relations need to be made friendlier so that India is able to reduce its dependency on China, and doing this is no easy job. Our government is failing in this front as well, considering the relations we see with Nepal today. So these are some ways that we can adopt on an individual level and what the government can adopt on its level in order to lower our dependency on China and to boycott it. I hope you would have liked this video. Share it so that it reaches more and more people so that they are able to take actions in their lives to reduce the use of Chinese products as much as possible. I'm saying as little as possible because not everything can be boycotted, or that you shouldn't use that all even if you need it. The use of Chinese products should be reduced as much as possible. I hope you would have liked this video. We will meet again in the next video. Thank you. Goodbye. Take care.